I think it has to be said that Britain was never a great friend to Commonwealth nations wishing to trade inside the European Union, largely because Britain had its own products it wanted to sell and didn't really want European products, Commonwealth products barging in. The thing about Cyprus and Malta are small countries with a limited range of products and services and commodities. It means they are much more likely to try and find, particularly using innovative technology, ways in which they can be the service points and entry points for Commonwealth goods and services. So, frankly, if you're going to be a banker and you've got the choice of being in London at the moment or being in Luxembourg and Frankfurt, why on earth would you exchange one rainy city with culture for one of the other rainy cities with no culture whatsoever? Why don't you go to Cyprus and have a beach? It's just the same. So I think there is a case for Cyprus and Malta becoming quite powerful agents for the Commonwealth within the European Union as a consequence of Brexit. Final thing I just want to say about Commonwealth. Commonwealth is not really even about, it's not about exclusivity. I don't think it can create preference. We have to think of the Commonwealth as being an alignment of countries, not an alliance. And the benefit of being an alignment is that individual countries can get together within the Commonwealth and can actually pursue objectives which don't require everyone else to be participants. The problem with an alliance is you go at the pace of the slowest or you go at the pace of the most belligerent. The advantage of an alignment, which is not a treaty obligation, is that actually groups of you can go pretty fast. And I think the Commonwealth has got to start thinking of Brexit as creating an opportunity for new trade alignments in the Commonwealth than anything else. Final thing, and that's to do with where the Commonwealth can go with all of this. The benefit that might come from Brexit or otherwise, in the end, has got to be felt by individual companies, individual entrepreneurs, individual investors across the Commonwealth, if anything is going to occur. In the end, we have to recognise that trade has problems because governments get in the way of people trading. There is not a single trade barrier put in the way of trade by businesses. It's put in the way of businesses by government. So governments within the Commonwealth have got to start thinking about facilitation and enabling and standards as a way of promoting and removing the barriers they choose for political reasons to put in the way of trade. So I have high hopes, but I do recognise we live in a world without a single free trade agreement in place, and the Commonwealth is not the panacea to end all that. But I think there are opportunities within the Commonwealth created by Britain leaving, and that's not caused by the fact that Britain will get advantage.
We're going to move on now to India, but before we do, India being one country, big, huge country, and knuckle down on that. But I noticed, Linda, that India was not in your group of countries that had 86% of the trade that was going on. So you've got this huge, and nor was Nigeria. So these are two huge countries that have got a lot of weight, but are not in the economic sort of basket that's necessary. Just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
I think India, and it is a puzzle why India isn't trading more with the rest of the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. I mean, Linda may have an answer to this, but I think it's a psychological problem rather than an economic problem. It's not that India is short of innovative commerce. It's not that it's short of resources. It's not that it doesn't need them. I suppose there is a case for the fact it is a vast internal market and then increasingly diverse internal market. So maybe it doesn't need to look outside, but I suppose part of my job in what we do is to try and encourage entrepreneurs to be expeditionary and to get out there and to realise that international trade is not just about making money, it's actually about having fun. And you have a much more interesting life by trading internationally than you do by simply doing business domestically. Nigeria is an interesting issue. I think there is a problem within Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa, with intra-African trade. And the breakthrough is being made in East Africa by the removal of trade barriers, particularly behind border barriers and border barriers. So I think there is, Africa does a huge amount, an enormous amount of trade, but very little internally. So I think there is work to be done on trying to increase intra-African trade, and that may be the route to actually get Nigeria trading more. And I lived in Nigeria for 4 years. I wouldn't pretend I even began to understand how the country functioned, but it does somehow. And it's not all down to star beer and high life music. It is down to something which is innately business driven by them, but we've got to get more products out there. We've got to get Nigerians interacting more around the world generally, because I think they are a rich and dynamic market for Africa.
It strikes me, I mean, the conversations that I had about 10 years ago in China was about the fact that it didn't have to go into the world, and it had this huge domestic market. And then the next thing we know, it's dominating the world, and all our phones and everything are made by Chinese companies. John, the Brexit, the Prime Minister has been to India, the Chancellor, the Bank of England, the whole lot. Has it had any impact at all? Are they cutting deals under the table that we don't know about?
Prime Ministers seem to think that if they go to India and say how marvellous it is that something's going to happen. David Cameron made 3 visits there as Prime Minister and charmed people in a way that Theresa May didn't even bother to try to charm. He said when he became Prime Minister in 2010 that he would double bilateral trade with India within 5 years, but it actually fell in dollar terms from 15.7 billion to 14 billion in the next 4 years, despite India's strong economic growth. He took a posse of ministers. He was made a fuss of. He made some good speeches. Theresa May then went there herself last year on what I would call a frigid visit, where she failed to talk about education or students' visas. And then she sent the Chancellor of the Exchequer along, most surprisingly, with the Governor of the Bank of England, who was sort of kowtowed along with him. And didn't really achieve anything, and 2 or 3 other ministers, they all came within 2 weeks. And they're all made a fuss of in the way that ministers are. Ministers pass through Delhi from all sorts of countries every day of the week. But Britain, when they turn up, somehow expects something special to happen. And as Cameron found, and Theresa May wasn't briefed properly how to handle it, little happens as a result. And I think that India, the chance of Britain having anything very special with India, despite the fact the finance minister said we'll set up a working group and we'll discuss it. Of course, India is a country where working groups are more important than the results that they produce, and the results they produce are more important than the plans to implement them, and the plans to implement them are more important than the execution plan, and the execution plan is more important than actually doing anything at the end of it. So saying we'll have a working group on how to sort out trade with Britain after Brexit is the least that anybody could go away with. I don't think there's any chance of anything very fast unless Theresa May changes her line on free movement of labour. She did budge on something this morning on tax, what allowances for the poor. Yeah, for the poor. Whether that will make her less willing to start to change anything else, or whether she's on a slippery slope, time will tell. But she won't budge on. There's 2 or 3 things that are needed. One is making it easier for students to stay on after degrees. Another one is just to have students in Britain. Another one is Indian companies find it difficult to transfer staff in and out of the country, which is crazy, given the fact that India, the companies are the biggest manufacturing employer, I think it is, in Britain. And none of that changed. What she did offer was a fast-track immigration queue for businessmen who were rich enough to buy it, which wasn't really what was needed.
Like Vijay Mallya.
Like Vijay Mallya. Yeah, in fact, the most important thing that happened that week as a gesture was when Britain actually moved 1 inch further nearer to sending Vijay Mallya back to the liquor baron and airline baron who's wanted in India, back to the country. That was a far bigger gift than anything else that came out of the talks. And the point that's been made already, and would have been made in a more than I'm going to make it, but let me mention it, by Mihir Sharma, the Indian journalist who should be sitting here, and I'm standing in for him because he had to go to the G20 meeting in Berlin, is that all these countries, as has been said already, have now moved on from buying British goods. Yeah. In the 50s, 50%, a third of exports went to India. Now it's a tiny percent, 2 or 3%. So the people have moved on. India buys goods from America. It buys an amount, and it buys from Korea, and it buys from Japan, and everything else it buys from China. So the idea that India is just sitting there waiting to be a great trade partner with Britain is, I think, for the birds. So I hold out no great hopes of anything very fast. The British government will have to change its stance on free movement of labour. There are also other problems like whisky exports, and Boris Johnson got himself into trouble with some Sikh gentlemen. I'm not sure if he was actually in a Gurdwara or near a Gurdwara, talking about whisky exports the other day.
He was told off, apparently, on the spot. He was told off.
He was told off on the spot, yes. So whisky exports is a difficult thing. But whisky exports and cars and a whole load of other matters are going to come up, which are going to dog the talks in the same way that they've been dogging talks between the EU and India, who've been talking for years and years and years about a trade deal, which still hasn't happened. Let me move on to the next subject. If the Commonwealth wants to do something, then... Is that all I've got left?
Yes.
My God. If the Commonwealth wants to do something, then it needs to somehow get itself together. It needs to somehow reform itself and find new leadership. And surprisingly, there are thoughts in Delhi, should India somehow try to work with the UK to rebuild the Commonwealth? Small countries will probably say no. That's the last thing we want is India trampling all over the place. And as the chairman will agree with me even more than I agree with myself, India is not good at diplomacy. It's not good at international diplomacy. It usually upsets more people than it pleases in any international meeting, and it goes away with having caused disruption and without trying to get agreement. But there is a Prime Minister in the job at the moment who wants to lead. And he does want to lead with effect as opposed to just with protest, which is the normal way. C. Raja Mohan, who's one of India's leading strategic writers, wrote in 2011 that there was a role for India and the UK to get together to try to work a way of building the Commonwealth in the future, and that India should take over some of the leadership role from London because as a rising power it could influence the Commonwealth's economic prospects, offer a technical and economic security. Otherwise, he said, if Delhi and London, this was 2011, if Delhi and London don't act together and decisively, they will soon find that China, whose commercial and strategic presence across different regions of the world will grow, will turn the Commonwealth into a historical footnote. So with One Belt, One Road on one side, and with America on the other, isn't there a role for another organisation? Let me not mention NAM or I'll be laughed out of the room. But is there not a role for another organisation to step up and become an economic powerhouse while China does its thing and moves across where it can, and America tries to exert whatever influence it wants to in the next 5 or 10 years, or however long Trump is there? Isn't there a role for the Commonwealth to build itself as the third economic force, to counter One Belt, One Road? Something needs to counter it. You can't all just sit back. I know Britain signed up to it. You can't just sit back and let that happen without having some alternative. And if there is going to be an alternative, is India, under the current Prime Minister, the sort of person who might be able to lead? Probably no. But let's discuss it.
I just want to check one thing with you. Ken Clarke, who's one of the father of the House now, gave a wonderful Brexit speech where he talked about the British government being in an Alice in Wonderland world. Is that the feeling that India got or you got when Theresa May came, when these delegations come, that they're on a completely different planet?
Yes, and I think also on Brexit. When I first went to India in 1982, Maggie Thatcher had just sent the British fleet sailing towards the Falklands. And the Indian people I met said, we thought India had grown out of that sort of thing. And now when Brexit happened, people said to me, how can Britain be so stupid? And so it is Alice in Wonderland.
Except
sitting
we
in
won the
India,
Falklands
wondering how on earth this country could get itself into such a muddle.
Yeah.
I would just like to put it to the panel generally that, Linda, you a few a little while ago mentioned how tough it is to negotiate trade agreements with the United States of America, particularly now under Donald Trump. But is that not simply because the United States of America is one of the most powerful economies in the world, and that everybody, practically everybody who ever tries to negotiate with them is negotiating from a position of relative weakness? I would suggest to the panel that henceforth Britain, or maybe just England, will be negotiating constantly from a position of weakness, and that there is very little, we're offering other countries in the world a chance to trade with a market of 60 million, when earlier we could have offered them a chance to trade with a market of 500 million.
I just wanted to, as we were walking in Lord SI, I was reminding you of 10 years ago when you spoke at this South Asia Business Forum, the largest gathering of people from a business background outside South Asia talking about South Asia. And you really excited many people in the room, because you were speaking to the business diaspora in the room 10 years ago. 10 years on, you've got clearly a changing landscape in terms of the business diaspora, not just in the UK but in other Commonwealth countries. And yet, there is no clear strategy, let alone no clear thinking on how to develop that as an opportunity in terms of bridging to markets, boundary spanners, people who, quite frankly, don't care about travel advice. If they'll travel, they'll find a way to do business. I think Lord Marden, some record of saying actually entrepreneurs really at the end of the day, they're not going to be held back by it right here. So I think there's this point around how can we tap into not just what's often termed as the diaspora, but this is the point, the changing landscape of the business diaspora. Sajid Jade, Priti Patel, they are people from the diaspora with a business background who are now in government, and there are many, many others like that in different areas. The business diaspora, whether it's in Kenya, or whether it's in Australia, or whether it's in Canada or the UK, is there, and there's an opportunity to tap into that in a very focused and clear way, and yet that's not happening. So I'd be interested in any comments and thoughts on that.
All right, and there was one over, yes.
I've got one comment and one question, and I'll put them in reverse order. My comment comes first. We've been talking about lots of things, but I doubt if we have realized how big Asia is. Does our concept of Asia include Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Syria? Or have we forgotten, conveniently pushed them aside? But that was the center of wealth in the world till about recently, the oil. What has happened to that? But let's all forget that, we'll think about it. And again, your concept of the Commonwealth, just trade and Brexit. No, it's too narrow. The Commonwealth has much more in common. Britain has much more to contribute. A whole civilization is based. And we have conveniently forgotten what we said in 1972 under Edward Heath, that if and when we join the European Union, the biggest contribution Britain would make would be diplomacy. And it still has it, although we are not as good as we used to be. And that is something very important. And don't forget, and I've got a poem addressed to Her Majesty the Queen, which I'll distribute in a minute. Don't forget the role of the Queen as well. She's held in affection by many people. She's the only one who is not politically involved in just greed, economic trade. I think I'd better stop that before I go into it.
Was that the question? Or thank you very much. So you're a fan of Empire 2 by the sounds of it.
No. I can criticize the Empire heavily, but I don't forget the positive side.
All right.
There are two sides to it. Have you come across any issue which is only one-sided? Even in Russia, it's not in one-sided.
Of course. Thank you.
To everything.
Thank you. Brilliant. Let's try and... I think the essence of that is, will Britain be negotiating from a position of weakness, and how much can the diaspora strengthen that weakness, as it were? Lord Desai.
Well, let me put it this way, that when I spoke on the South Asia Business Forum long ago, I was really trying to do something about how the diaspora can contribute to peace in South Asia. I was not concerned about Britain and trade and so on. Now, most remarkable fact is when Americans send ambassadors abroad, they use their minorities very creatively. So a Polish American is sent to Poland, right? Not a single diaspora person has been sent either to India or to Pakistan. Briefly, lately, one person was sent to Bangladesh. I mean, you treat the diaspora with contempt. Foreign office will not stand anybody taking the plum jobs in India, Pakistan, and so on. And then you suddenly go, oh, but we've got a diaspora, our diaspora is our great strength. But thank you. You have not used the diaspora. You haven't even shown some consideration in your student visas. Maybe the Commonwealth ought to be treated better than other people. Of course not. And so you can't just conjure up the Commonwealth when you need it and then forget it when you don't need it. And as far as I know, and some people have said, the Commonwealth actually, I've talked to Indian businessmen, they say, if you want machinery, we don't come to the UK. UK has nothing to sell to us. We go to Germany, we go to America. And who'd come to UK for manufacturing sort of capital goods? Yes, we are good at culture and all that, and we should do more of it. But I think, anyway, I should also say parenthetically that anybody who invented the word Empire 2.0 has done the biggest damage to Britain's chances with the Commonwealth. Because some people in Whitehall may think that Empire 1 was so great that the Commonwealth is grateful. But, you talk again about the empire and they'll say just get lost.
The Queen is not going to be around forever.
Yeah.
And one day, as they say in India, she will be no more. Or as you say in England, she'll fall under a number 10 bus, except that she never sees them. She will, and then a new leader will be needed. And it probably shouldn't come from Britain. Where should it come from? And it was in that context that I was talking about.
I mean, the shift of the royal family or the head of state in the church.
The royal family here. I was thinking
but
the
they
power in the
will no
Commonwealth.
longer be the head of the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Okay.
Or you change the role in some way so that you have the leadership somewhere else. It's not going to be able to stay here. Diaspora, of course, are a nuisance for governments in whichever way you look at it, whether it's the travelling in or the travelling out. High commissioners in this city have problems handling the diaspora and wonder whether they're the high commissioners for the diaspora or the high commissioners for the British government. And look at how the diaspora dance around presidents in India. But there should be a role for them. And I was talking to some Indian businessmen busy in Africa the other evening at the dinner, and they were talking about how active things can be, and of course that can be built on, and it can be used to extend.
We're very big in rebuilding a lot of China's economy. I don't know about the Nigerian diaspora. I mean, how important is this into lifting countries out of poverty?
I think it's mixed. I think there have been some countries where it's had a significant impact, and some where it hasn't. Diaspora are potentially a huge asset within the Commonwealth as a whole. But I think the thing there is to try and find people in the diaspora who are doing good things, not try and drag everyone in the diaspora. I remember there was an incident a few years ago where the government of India tried to give an award to somebody of Indian descent in South Africa for being the most powerful person in the diaspora. They refused to accept it. They said, I'm a South African, I'm not Indian. I may be of Indian descent, but I'm not Indian. So I think we've got to basically go with the flow. There are parts of the diaspora who are really keen on being diasporic, and there are some who said, sorry, that's no longer, that was never my country. This is my country. And I think we have to respect that. I think can I just say something about weakness? One thing I think I've learnt, actually I learnt it last week and it really rammed home to me. Why is Singapore a successful trading nation? It's a country of 4 million people on basically a boggy island. How did it do it? The reason is it focused the things it was good at and focused on trading in those with the outside world. It didn't try and say, I have to be dominant and I have to be in charge and I have to be top dog. It said, this is what I've got to trade and this is what I want to sell. And so they focus on that. I think trade happens because people have things that other people want to buy. It doesn't happen because governments want to be in charge or to be weak or strong.
I mean, one of the things, just coming to the question about the United States, every country is weak when you negotiate against the United States. The United States is the world's biggest market, biggest economy. The reason why President Trump likes bilateral trade deals is obvious, because they are the stronger bargaining partner. So in a multilateral deal, he'll get more of his way if he can negotiate against one country. And the U.S. really doesn't actually have many FTAs. It's got 14 FTAs with 20 countries. And the president is renegotiating NAFTA at the moment. And so I think even if the U.S. is strong, the sentiment in the U.S. is actually now pushing the other way. So coming to this point about weakness, against the U.S., I think everyone is weak. But Britain is actually the world's 5th biggest economy. And so I think leaving the EU, it might be viewed as relative weakness since the market we have to offer might be smaller. But I'm actually increasingly of the opinion that size doesn't dictate everything in trade. And we talked a moment ago about India. India has, in terms of trade penetration, it's less than 1% of global trade of manufactured goods, which is very small. So it just depends on the priorities of the country. Obviously, we are all proponents of an open society, open economy, but that means different things for different countries. So I think for Britain, it was never in a position to negotiate on behalf of the other 27 anyways, the 500 million people. But as I said a moment ago to our colleague from the Chinese embassy, I think there is a question about how attractive Britain is as a place to invest in trade if it's no longer viewed as the gateway. So I think that is one dimension to be thinking about. But I think in general, I think the UK shouldn't undersell itself. It has a lot of advantages as an international financial center.